It's really my honor to be here. I've been here for many years in succession, and this year in particular, I'm very, very honored to be asked to deliver the first Peter E. Lange lecture. But the title has given me some problems because it says historical evolution, and I must admit to you all that I'm no historian. So I was stuck for quite a bit, but nevertheless, I took up the challenge and said, okay, I'll see what I can do. So I apologize if I've omitted a lot of major facts and points that you thought were very important. That, I think, particularly is due to my lack of knowledge of other languages apart from English, which I admit to being able to read and write to a certain extent, not exceptionally well. But that's all I can manage, so that's the literature I can go by. So anyway, moving on then, I thought I would sort of put in some points that we might want to go over. I think that we can't really talk about the right ventricular outflow tract patho-anatomy without having some background to how it came about. So I would like to spend some minutes on history of knowledge of the heart in general and knowledge of the circulation. Well, the heart has been recognized as a central element of systemic channels distributed throughout the body, transporting bodily fluids. In the very early days in Egypt, 305,000 BC, and also in around about 2000 BC in China, the heart has been also recognized as a central structure. But in those days, there was no distinction between vein and artery. And later on, exceptionally, I must say, the Egyptians recognized that the peripheral pulse originated from the heartbeat. And it was documented in one of the papyrus writings that when the heart is diseased, its vessels become inactive so that you cannot feel them. So they were already into physiology of the heart. And later on, they stated that palpitation of the pulse, the presence of air in fluids and other contents in the channel. Then came the Greek school, of course. Two ventricles, right side of ventricle larger than the left side of ventricle, and also noticed that the left side of ventricle is thicker. And commented on pore in the ventricular septum. They also noted two valves and two structures similar to the cardiac ear that captured air, but these were not counted as part of the heart. And later, Aristotle, working on animal dissections, found that, or commented that blood formed in the liver from which food was transported to the heart and distributed it throughout the body where it was consumed. And commented on three ventricles all connected to the lungs, two great vessels, superior vena cava and pulmonary artery were subdivisions of great vein. Now the three ventricles were quite intriguing, and these are his diagrams, his sketches. And it took some time before the Van Pragues came up with the interpretation of the Tri Ventricular Heart. In ancient Greek, ventricles means cavities, so not the ventricles that we know of these days. So the auricles were distinguished from cavities, and the right atrium regarded as a venous dilatation of the cable veins instead of a chamber in itself. So the three ventricles documented were, according to the Van Pragues, the right ventricle, and left atrium. And this is a sort of diagram for another publication that documented this sort of arrangement, with the middle ventricle supposedly to be the left ventricle as we know it these days. But still back in Egypt, the Alexandria school, particularly important in those days, then commented on the differences between arteries and veins. I think this is a significant step forward, and also described the atrioventricular valves and commented on arterial endings and veins, although they did not ascribe a functional continuity between them. Then we come to Galen, 130 to 2200 AD, dissecting animals, commented that arteries carried blood as well as air. And Galen's teachings and influence lasted quite a long time, 15 centuries. But he referred to in the left ventricle, the blood is mixed with pneuma, which is the soul and the spirit in those days, interpretation. Light and colored, carried to the rest of the body to be consumed by the organs. In other words, the circulation, as it were in those days, was thought to be an open-ended centrifugal system. Importantly, he commented on pores in the septum between right and left ventricle, permitting blood flow from right to left. In the right ventricle had 2 vessels, and so on and so forth. Then there's some debate in recent decades about who actually described the pulmonary circulation. When we come to the Islamic area back in 1000 AD, quite interesting, 4 cavities in the heart, 2 pores in the ventricular septum, but most of the blood received by the right ventricle was transported to the lungs. And from the lungs, blood was transported to the left ventricle, from there to the aorta and throughout the body. And they noted that the function of the heart was to pump the blood, and that blood vessels carried only blood, not the pneuma. I think this is quite significant if that can be proven definitively, because in the era before that, it was thought that the heart sucks the blood in instead of pumping the blood out, being the main function of the heart. And there was the theoretical basis of pulmonary circulation, probably described as blood circulated via the lungs and not through the ventricular septum. So in other words, there can be pores in the ventricular septum. Then comes the European era, and then the Renaissance period, these very famous medical schools, Salerno, Bologna, and Padua, and these very important findings by the anatomists in those days attributed function of the heart, the atria contracted while the ventricles dilated, and recognized that the heart is made of muscle, not a seat of spirits or air. And we moved on to Servetus and Colombo, and I think both of them probably described the pulmonary circuit simultaneously in that era. It's very difficult to say for sure who was there, who got there first. So they noted that there was a circuit that allowed blood to mingle with air in the lungs, and this process was not done in the left ventricle. But still, there was no concept of a closed circulation system in the human body. Of course, it was not until the period of Harvey that Lange that then set the foundation for the circulation in the human body. But interesting enough, I think he still was believing in spirits in the veins and arteries were not distinct from the blood any more than the flame of a lamp is distinct from the inflammable vapor that is on fire. And these days, of course, there are a lot of people who consume wine in this room, of course. For a wine, when it has lost all its spirit, is no longer wine, but a vapid liquor or vinegar. So blood without spirit is not blood, but something else. But he did notice that he did comment that blood must move in a circuit. Okay? He did not support Galen's concept of pores in the ventricular septum, but commented on pores in the tissues that allowed exchanges of arterial side to the venous side. So therefore, sets in thought the pulmonary circulation and the human circulation. So this paper summarizes actually the steps in the progression of our understanding of circulation. So initially, arteries and veins are separate, 2 separate circuits with end arteries. And then we move on to Galen arteries containing blood, but transmission through the ventricular septum to get to the left side and mix with the pneuma. And later on, establishment of the pulmonary circulation, but open-ended for the other channels. And eventually, Harvey's closed circulation system. So then, what about the right ventricle outflow tract? How did the development of anatomical understanding happen? As I could only read English, I relied then on Quain's Elements of Anatomy back in 1929 that showed a picture of Tandler's cast. So this was an endocast, in which Tandler described the walls of the right ventricle. There are 4 components to the walls of the right ventricle: a medial, an anterolateral, a posterior inferior, and a narrow upper wall or roof which runs forwards and to the left from the atrioventricular to the arterial orifice. So this is probably the structure that lies between the venous arterial orifices and the roof of the right ventricle, a thickened, rounded muscular ridge, the crista supraventricularis. And Walmsley commented on dividing the ventricular cavity into a posterior inflowing and an anterior outflowing region. Taking the Tandler's endocast, we replicated our own endocast, but this time putting it more in attitudinal orientation. So you see a left lateral and a right lateral 30 degree, and you note the holes in this endocast. These holes were filled by muscle bundles that I've had to remove in order to produce the endocast. Looking at the outflow tract of Tandler's cast, he commented that the anterolateral wall was richly set with trabeculations or columnar carnae, and posteriorly they reached the basal attachments of the tricuspid valve, but anteriorly, following upwards, they became gradually smaller and ultimately disappear, so that the interior of the conus arteriosus is smooth. But you will note on the endocast here already, it's not all that smooth. And pointing to the holes, they were actually muscle bundles in the outflow tract too. And talking of the end of that outflow tract, that's the pulmonary valve, of course. And even back in 1852, in the area of Henle, he already noted that the boundary between the ventricles and the arteries in a functional sense is easily defined as a line of attachment of the semilunar valves. And it would be apparent that the morphological boundary by no means corresponds to the functional boundary. And I think that very much reflects what we currently think, that we have reinvented the wheel to say that the semilunar insertions of the valve is the boundary. Okay? So Henle was the first to draw attention to the difficulty of defining the ventricular arterial boundary and introduced the term arterial root to replace the term arterial ring. So diagrammatically, I would say instead of a ring or annulus, we have this formation. This is already known way back in the 1800s. And we also noticed interleaflet fibrous triangles between the semilunar insertions. Again, this was already known back in the 1800s, although we are reselling it and redressing it and saying, wow, this is new invention. It isn't. McAlpine, back in 75, already also drew attention, well before us. Annulus, ill-founded, no such structure to be found. And I think this helps very much the understanding of the functional anatomy of the valve. If you have something like this formation, it's rigid and it cannot move properly. Now coming back to the outflow, it's probably Walmsley and Quain's anatomy that first referred to the outflowing part of the heart, what we call nowadays the right ventricular outflow tract. So he highlighted the crista supraventricularis and also drew attention to the moderator band. And of course, in this weekend's symposium, it's the freeway to the lung. So if we take a step backward, how does the right ventricular outflow tract develop? Well, here are a couple of movies here showing you two bilateral cardiogenic fields merging to form the primary cardiac tube. So they fuse, you can turn the tube around, and it begins to bulge and to fold upon itself. So we have the sinus venosus part and the outflow part there. And here we are turning around. The sinus venosus becomes more cephalad, going posteriorly and more cephalad, and we begin to get the formation of the outflow region. Yeah, we can see that fold or the loop to the right, okay? The cardiac looping. And bringing up the sinus venosus, turning round to the front. We see the developing atria, developing ventricles, and the shift of the outflow here, and the atrioventricular part to the rightward shift. But then we have only one channel. It takes a while for this channel to be divided or separated into two. So they are separated by two pairs of cushions within the lumen. And here we are, we see the two channels separated up into aorta and pulmonary vessels, and the outflow tract similarly into the right and the left ventricular outflow tracts. But there's probably a change in phenotype between the muscle of the outflow tract and fibroelastic arterial walls, because we know that from the early descriptions of anatomy, there's no such thing as an arterial ring, okay? And how does the right ventricular outflow tract, or the pulmonary valve, gets above the aortic valve? And Gittenberger de Groot's paper suggests that there is asymmetric addition of myocardial progenitors at the level of the outflow tract that pushes the pulmonary trunk to a higher and more frontal position. And abnormalities in the contribution of second heart field may then result in these various forms of congenital malformations. Small outflow tract or reduced rotation and wedging or defective contribution of neurocrest cells and defective AP septum, giving you persistent truncus arteriosus. And more recently, there are different cell types involved in the development of the right ventricular outflow tract. The TBX2 expresses working myocardial genes, which may be represented by CX40, CX43, and SCN5A. So we see the progression of the development of the red and the green areas relatively. In the adult heart, that red area is very much reduced. And we have a lighter colored area there, which shows low expression of SCN5A and CX43, which then favors slow conduction and low excitability. So maybe contributing to arrhythmias in Brugada or arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia. Now, what do we know nowadays? And what can we apply with the knowledge? Well, coming to the front of the heart, of course, we have well-endowed epicardial fat over these regions. Epicardial fat pads are very topical amongst the electrophysiologists on account of the ganglionated plexi that they contain within them, part of the sympathetic nervous system. Can they be causing some types of arrhythmias? Coronary veins and arteries. Well, some of these may be abnormally formed and may have muscular coatings contributing to a venous type of accessory atrioventricular pathways, for example, sitting on top of the right ventricular outflow tract. And also we know that the right atrial appendage overlaps the right ventricular outflow tract. And would that be significant if an interventionist goes into the right atrial appendage and implants a pacing lead deep into the appendage? Will they go through the thin wall of the atrial appendage and penetrate into the right ventricular outflow tract, and so on and so forth. With the clever imaging these days, of course, you know the right ventricle is sitting right behind the sternum, so maybe a little bit tricky for echocardiographic examinations, but the CT images, I think, shows that very well. I think the important realization in the more recent decades is a crossover relationship of right and left ventricular outflow tracts. That is a kind of teaching point for screening sonographers screening heart malformations, and we say to them, if you don't see a crossover relationship, think abnormality. So maybe there is a point there to sort of focus on a crossover or spiral relationship between the outflow tracts. And by making a longitudinal cut, we see just this. the right ventricular outflow tract sitting on top of the left ventricular outflow tract. You all know this very well with cross-sectional echocardiography or transesophageal or transthoracic views. But is there an outlet septum in the normally structured heart? Well, let's see. If you take a right ventricle and open it up, it seems to give you the impression that there is an outlet septum. But anatomically, we have to be wary of this region of the heart. It's not actually an outlet septum. There are various terminologies used, and this is the one we use in the UK. And there is also trabecular septum marginalis that overlies the right ventricular aspect of the septum. And in North American terminology may be represented by Dr. Van Praag's terminology, the parietal band, or distal conal septum, or septal band and proximal conal septum. So these are interchangeable terminologies. But sticking with the UK or English UK terminology rather than, we have this still image of the right ventricular outflow tract. I've taken away the free wall, and we can see this curvature in the ventriculoinfundibular fold. And I've plotted in the course of the right bundle branch, emerging from the medial pulmonary muscle, descending very superficially down the endocardial surface, down the trabecular septum marginalis, and then the larger bundle of it crosses the moderator band to go to the free wall of the right ventricle. And ink injections in this heart, done by one of the medical students working with us, demonstrates that Purkinje fiber network spreading all the way around the right ventricle. But coming to a close-up view of that region, we notice the coronary artery is very close to the right ventricular outflow tract, isn't it? Right coronary, left anterior descending coronary. And this is an image showing you just that. The supply to the right ventricular outflow tract by the conal branch may form the Wilson's arterial ring, and the anterior descending coronary artery with the first branch, the first septal perforator coming into the septum. And we can see that also on our longitudinal cuts through the heart. Back to the question, is there a septum? No, that's actually ventriculoinfundibular fold. We are just above the sinotubular junction now. As we cut through here, we're not into the left ventricular cavity. So that structure is not a septum, but we also notice muscle bands out here, the septoparietal trabeculations, and this is a normally structured heart. The other side of this similar cut, we can locate for you the atrioventricular node and conduction bundle in relation to membranous septum. We can still see the septoparietal trabeculations and the crista supraventricularis. And some of these muscle bundles may be the basis for partitioning a right ventricle into a two-chambered right ventricle. A high partition may be caused by a hypertrophy of septoparietal trabeculation, for example, and a lower partition may be due to a trabecular septum marginalis, crista, or moderator band together. And we all know nowadays that the characteristic feature of phallocentralogy is an anterocaphlate deviation of the outlet septum, but oftentimes added to it is hypertrophy of the septoparietal trabeculations, as we see in this heart specimen, very, very much narrowing that outflow tract, giving you submuscular obstruction. And we also noted that in late sudden cardiac death after repair in this study involving 3 heart specimens, that obviously there was increased fibrosis in the site of ventriculotomy, but also in the outflow tract there was increase in fibrosis. And this increase in fibrosis we can show by using serous rate staining and documenting that the interstitial fibrosis is very much increased, and more recently, our PhD student, Yiling, under supervision of Sonia, have also shown this, have confirmed this situation. And we were able, using working with Sonia's CMR late gadolinium enhancement, possible to correlate histologically that the enhancement, the brighter areas, were due to increase in fibrosis, and this is in a systemic right ventricle. So then, coming to the valve, what is the pulmonary valve then? We have the 3 segments of muscle within the pulmonary sinuses themselves, because the ventricular arterial junction is crossing just here, and we see also the 3 interleaflet triangles that are part of the ventricular circulation rather than the pulmonary circulation, because they are underneath when the valves are closed. The interleaflet triangles, although part of belonging in terms of histological structure belongs to the arterial wall, in fact functionally sits in the ventricular side. And this can also be documented, of course, in your most recent CT imaging, this sort of structure, that freestanding subpulmonary infundibulum. And that freestanding subpulmonary infundibulum demonstrated here, pulling forward, and the relationship between that region of the right ventricular outflow tract, the so-called septal region, which is not truly septal, backs up against the right and left coronary aortic sinuses. And these may be accessed for infundibular foci, utilizing the aortic sinuses to reach arrhythmogenic foci, focal sites within the right ventricular outflow tract that are facing the aortic sinuses. In terms of understanding of the pulmonary valve stenosis, we can say that some of them may be just dysplasia of the leaflets. The leaflets are formed properly, but some are not. Some are, the pulmonary sinuses may be too shallow, or on the other hand, the pulmonary sinuses may be very deep, forming pockets that cause a restriction across the sinotubular junction to give this sort of flask-shaped pulmonary stenosis, which is very rare. The more common type is this sort of situation where there's attempt to form different separate valvular leaflets, but not quite complete, and very, very shallow sinuses. In terms of muscular arrangement, the circumferential on the outside, longitudinal on the inside. In fact, circumferential accounts for about 2/3 of the full wall thickness, and EP mapping has shown the earliest activation of right ventricular outflow tract tachycardias in the shape of an ellipse with a longer dimension across a diameter, suggesting that the impulse is going round following the arrangement of the myocardial strands. And in phallocentrology, the muscle is also changed. We don't normally have a middle region in the right ventricular outflow tract or in the right ventricle in phallocentrology, but in the hypertrophied right ventricle, in this situation, instead of going this way, the fibers turn around more obliquely and then finally become longitudinally. And modern imaging allows us to delineate the region of fibrosis, as in this case with phallocentrology. I'm sure you're going to see more of this imaging later on. And we show you the 3D printed heart of one of these cases, the outflow tract region, very fibrotic, and inside the heart, the blue in the right ventricle demonstrates the fibrotic regions. And note how on the endocardial surface, that fibrotic region is much more extensive compared to the epicardial region. Moving away from congenital heart malformations, there can also be applications in terms of cardiomyopathies like arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, this study demonstrating that by looking at the changes in shapes of the right ventricle, that may be and give a measure of the risk of these patients. So what about the future, coming to the end? Can this sort of imaging become routine? In this case, post-Fallows repair, but patient also had a coronary event affecting the left circumflex artery, so mapping out the fibrotic regions also in the left ventricle. Transcatheter pulmonary valve replacement, since as the first case, I think, was 17 or 18 years ago now. Is there remodeling of the right ventricle after that, and what's the long term? And of course, developments of regeneration of the ventricular myocytes, for example, or stem cell, to help us repair the heart, tissue-engineered valve, of course, coming along very well. So just like the evolution of the understanding of this circulation, I think evolution of patho-anatomical knowledge of the right ventricular outflow tract has taken a while, and it's taken us across many continents and over the world. I would finally like to say that on that historical theme, my first meeting of Professor Peter Lange, okay, was at this symposium, the farewell symposium of Professor Carlo Phelps, and who should turn up? Father Christmas. Okay. So these are the giants that I've learned from also, amongst many of you pediatric cardiologists. I think it's been very much a two-way process. I've learned from lots of people also. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.